And now back to books probably nobody has ever heard of before. This one is from Howard Moss, and it's Instant Lives. As the world is sifted into time's archives, and the bee reduceth honey and its hives, so do we make our little instant lives. Louisa May Alcott. Louisa had Concord. Still, she felt a sense of loyalty, dim to the point of evasiveness, toward Karen, Lupe, and Olga, her madcap sisters, in whose eyes attainment and sluggishness were so uncomfortably abed. They all seemed to be of the same age. How could that be? Louisa often wondered. There they were, messily engaged in another spontaneous fudge-making contest that turned the front of the house brown. Karen and her fierce talents as a sculptress, Louisa with her good looks and imperturbable manners, and Olga with her cooking ability and a school of hard knocks brilliance. Only Louisa among them had been educated. In fact, none of the other girls could read or write, though they were, in an amateur, outdated way, tremendous talkers. Lupe inexplicably spoke nothing but Spanish, demonic at best. I'd rather spend the day with my hamster than a night with the Alcott girls. Miss Cockett, the postmaster, he said. He was later arrested as a firebug. Yet in spite of Louisa's many local attributes, not the least of which was to Lance Bierfew, the handsome fidget who lived next door, she felt it was time to go. The scope of her talents could not be measured in the small field of Concord's prejudice, and this was the last straw. Little Men had been condemned by the library vice squad as a vile pit of unseemingness for minds under 12, and a jungle of ugly sensuality for those 13 and over. Louisa characteristically had opted for confrontation and faced Miss Fortress Rondeau, the squad chairwoman, on the steps of the Caldecott High. Miss Fortress Rondeau, Louisa began. Don't speak to me, you disgusting girl, Miss Fortress Rondeau replied. She swept past Louisa into her bedroom where, drawing the curtains, she took a deep swig of camphor phenique, her one indulgent. 1 year later, she was to meet her tragic death. Outraged by a passage of Tennyson, she attempted to expunge the offending lines with her soap eraser and died an apologetic fury. In her extremity, she fell on top of her husband, a tiny mouse of a man, who perished in the attempt to aid her. A memorial statue, the arrival of the gnomes at Kitty Hawk, a tribute to the Rondeau family, still stands in the public square at Sedona, Massachusetts. Little frump, Louisa shouted after Mrs. Rondeau, anticipating in the singular the title of the novel she was never to finish. But her words were as wind music, and to no avail. Jane Austen. Jane, your hair is awfully dry tonight, said Jane Austen's sister as she toasted a marshmallow low over the grate. Evening like she overturned the fishbowl was falling over Sussex. The fire rose up in the mantel like a gentleman, as malleable as she was limber. Malapop the maid entered with a tea tray, curtsied, and the tray carefully balanced in her hands. She paused. Rise up, she said, Jane, tossing aside the gallery of Sense and Sensibility. Outside it was 1811. Another clever Another clever novel, miss? Asked Malaprop. She eyed the Dowdley pastries with a sickened eye. How could they? Cleverer by far Oak than Cook, said Jane, with asperity. She detested pastry, even when it was first-rate, an encomium that could hardly be applied to the millefeuille, whose layers sagged against one another, like a ruined house flayed by wet wind. The inanity of custard. If you've got more than royalties, her sister started to say, then bit her lip. Not that I'm complaining, she added. I'm in no position to complain. You have gauged your position precisely, Jane replied to her sister, though the accuracy of your assessment hardly acts as a restraining force. You're so worldly, Jane, said her sister. No wonder you have trouble with men. Smugness aside, the derogation, the remark conveyed was not lost, of course, on Jane. My dear Cassandra, she said, why don't you polish off the mephitic sweetmeats? It would only make your figure more Mons bizarre. I have to decline to meet, you know. And with that, Jane swept out of the room, the galleys trailing behind her like a bridal train devised by a contour impaled upon typography. But in life there would be no bridal train for Jane Austen. Sebastian Bach. What an interesting little book. Emily Dickinson. Cloud Boozy. I'm going to read Emily Dickinson. As the twilight gathered around her, Emily sat at the window and looked out at Amherst, a small, silent town wrought up here and there into gables. Like its lean cemeteries, its sense of scale was small but neatly done. This is Emily Dickinson. A hunchback, made sinister by dusk, hobbled off toward the local. The bar at the Lord Jeffrey was doing a bang-up business as usual. Amherst was no Arby of dazzling transports, but icicle blue needle of true north. Emily sighed. How secondary the primal can become, she thought. Poetry, which she had taken up to disguise the operation, now absorbed her completely. Though the illegal manufacture of witch hazel in New England could be laid solely at her door, she was, to the world at large, the wallflower sonneteer, a misnomer on two counts. She took a sip of dandelion wine from the fluted Waterford goblet on the windowsill. Across the way, the Reverend Hodgins was raising his hat. He bowed slightly. Her lace shawl shirred about her bird-like shoulders. Spinster, but also ruthless businesswoman, as the sailors sweating off the Rhode Island coast knew all too well. At this very moment, they were pumping barrel after barrel full of witch hazel, distilled from her secret formula. She had swallowed the recipe at the tense meeting in the cave near Mount Holyoke, where Rudolph Mosville, the wine merchant, threatened to wrest it from her by force. Only she knew the ingredients. And she had elected silence. The white sepulchral thing. Even the pirates had cheered. She still had a taste for the hazel, which surprised her. Considering the gallons she consumed, a line suddenly sprang into her head. I taste a hazel never brewed. She rushed over to her writing desk, an affair so elaborate it had come all the way from Boston. How many lines she had simply lost by thinking she could remember them. Brewed in, she bit the end of her pencil. She had so little time. She would spend half the night in the window waiting for the signal, the broomstick, hoisted over Amherst's gym. That would let her know the second ship, loaded with it, had departed for Portugal. Brewed in Portugal? No, barrels, that was it. I taste a hazel never brewed. In barrels? Barrels? What? Ah, she had it. Swept by brine. In barrels, swept by time. No, that wasn't right either. Brewed, bars, taverns. I taste a hazel ever brewed in taverns ripped by toil, on tabards scooped of oil. She was getting away from the subject, or was it the subject getting away from her? The original was better. I taste a hazel never brewed, in barrel scooped in brine, or was it stewed in brine? She looked down at the paper. The crucial verb was one word she hadn't written down, the signal. She was forgetting the signal. She dashed back to the window just in time to see the broomstick hoisted in the sky. That, at last, she accomplished. But in regard to the poem, she now knew, the terrible task of the revision that lay ahead. And that is that. Let me know if you like my sarcastic readings, or if I'm just a dumbass reading to nobody. That's always a possibility.